Welcome to the first episode of Novel Perceptions, a Lighthouse Productions literary podcast, bringing your favorite stories to life. This is Autumn Miller introducing today's episode, a special cut of Mrs. Dalloway, one of Virginia Woolf's most famous works. Grab your life jackets and get ready to float down this stream of consciousness. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself, for Lucy had a work cut out for her. The doors would be taken off their hinges. Rumpelmeyer's men were coming. And then, thought Clarissa Dalloway, what a morning, fresh as if issued to children on the beach. She stiffened a little on the curb. A charming woman, a touch of the bird about her, of the jay, blue-green, light, vivacious, though she was over 50, and grown very white since her illness. For having lived in Westminster, how many years now? Over 20. One feels even in the midst of the traffic, or waking at night, Clarissa was positive, a particular hush or solemnity. An indescribable pause, a suspense, but that might be her heart, affected, they said, by influenza, before Big Ben strikes. There, out it boomed. First a warning, musical, then the hour, irrevocable. The leaden circles dissolved in the air. Such fools we are, she thought, crossing Victoria Street. For heaven only knows why one loves it so, how one sees it so, making it up, building it round one, tumbling it, creating it every moment afresh. But the veriest frumps, the most dejected of miseries, sitting on doorsteps do the same. Can't be dealt with, she felt positive, by Acts of Parliament for that very reason. They love life. Her only gift was knowing people almost by instinct, she thought, walking on. She remembered once throwing a shilling into the Serpentine. Did it matter then, she asked herself, walking towards Bond Street? Did it matter that she must inevitably cease completely? All this must go on without her. Did she resent it, or did it not become consoling to believe that death ended absolutely? But that somehow in the streets of London, on the ebb and flow of things, here, there, she survived, Peter survived, lived in each other, she being part, she was positive, of the trees at home, of the house there, ugly, rambling all to bits and pieces as it was, part of people she had never met, being laid out like a mist between the people she knew best, who lifted her on their branches as she had seen the trees lift the mist, but it spread ever so far, her life, herself. How much she wanted it, that people should look pleased as she came in, Clarissa thought, and turned and walked back towards Bond Street, annoyed because it was silly to have other reasons for doing things.
Septimus Warren Smith, aged about 30, pale-faced, beak-nosed, wearing brown shoes and a shabby overcoat, with hazel eyes which had that look of apprehension in them, which makes complete strangers apprehensive too. The world has raised its whip. Where will it descend? He waited. He listened. The sparrow perched on the railing opposite chirped Septimus. Septimus, 4 or 5 times over, and went on, drawing its notes out to sing freshly and piercingly into Greek words. How there is no crime, and joined by another sparrow, they sang in voices prolonged and piercing in Greek words. From trees in the meadow of life beyond a river where the dead walk, how there is no death. A marvelous discovery indeed, that the human voice in certain atmospheric conditions, for one must be scientific, above all, scientific, can quicken trees into life.
What are you saying, said his wife, a little woman, with large eyes and a sallow, pointed face, an Italian girl.
He was weighted down, transfixed, or the excitement of the elm trees rising and falling, with all their leaves alight and the color thinning and thickening from the blue to the green of a hollow wave like the plumes on a horse's head, feathers on ladies. So proudly they rose and fell, so superbly. How would have sent him mad, but he would not go mad. He would shut his eyes. He would see no more.
I am alone, she cried by the fountain in Regent Park. For he was gone, she thought. Gone as he threatened to kill himself, to throw himself under a cart.
But no, there he was, still sitting alone on the seat, in his shabby overcoat, his legs crossed, staring, talking aloud.
But they beckoned. Leaves were alive, trees were alive, and the leaves being connected by millions of fibers with his own body. There on the seat it fanned up and down. When the branches stretched, he, too, made this statement. The branches, the sparrows fluttering, rising and falling in jagged formations, were part of the pattern, the white and blue, barred with black branches. Sounds made harmonies with premeditation. The spaces between them were, as sounded, all taken together, meant the birth of a new religion.
Let us go on, Septimus, said Rezia suddenly, sitting down by him.
Interrupted again. She was always interrupting. Away from the people, they must go. Go. Get away from people, he said, jumping up. Right away, over there, where were chairs beneath a tree, and on the long slope of the dark dipped like a length of green stuff with ceiling cloth of blue and pink smoke high above. There was a rampart of far irregular houses, hazed in smoke. The traffic hummed in a circle, and on the right, dun-colored animals stretched long necks over the zoo, pawings, barking, howling. There, they sat down under a tree, but the branches parted. A man in gray was actually walking towards them. I must tell the whole world, Septimus cried, raising his head as the dead man in the gray suit came near. He would turn round. He would tell them in a few moments, only a few moments more, of his relief, of his joy, of this astonishing revelation.
But I am so unhappy, Septimus.
And that is being young, Peter Walsh thought as he passed them. To be having an awful scene. The poor girl looked absolutely desperate. In the middle of the morning. But what was it about? He wondered. What had the young man in the overcoat been saying to her to make her look like that? What awful fix had they gotten themselves into? Both to look so desperate as that on a fine summer morning. The amusing thing about coming back to England after 5 years was the way it made, anyhow, the first few days, things stand out as if one had never seen them before. Lovers squabbling under a tree, the domestic family life of the parks. Never had he seen London look so enchanting. The softness of the distances, the richness, the greenness, the civilization after India, he thought, strolling along the grass. But it was Clarissa, one remembered. Not that she was striking, nor beautiful at all. There was nothing picturesque about her. She never said anything specially clever. There she was, however. There she was. No! He was not in love with her anymore. He only felt, after seeing her that morning, among her scissors and silks, making ready for the party, unable to get away from the thought of her. She kept coming back, and back, like a sleeper jolting against him in a railway carriage. Which was not being in love, of course. It was thinking of her, criticizing her, starting again, after 30 years, trying to explain her. A sound interrupted him, a frail, quivering sound, a voice bubbling up without direction, vigor, beginning or end, running weakly and shrilly, and with an absence of all human meaning into. The voice of no age or sex, the voice of an ancient spring sprouting from the earth, which issued just opposite Regent's Park tube station from a tall, quivering shape, like a funnel, like a rusty pump, like a wind-beaten tree forever barren of leaves, which lets the wind run up and down its branches singing, and rocks and creaks and moans in the eternal breeze. Peter Walsh couldn't help giving the poor creature a coin as he stepped into his taxi.
Sweet to so for sweet to emo. So for sweet to emo.
Going and coming, beckoning, signaling, so the light and the shadow which now made the wall gray, now the bananas bright yellow, now made the strand gray, now made the omnibuses bright yellow, seemed to Septimus Warren Smith lying on the sofa in the sitting room, watching the watery gold glow and fade with the astonishing sensibility of some live creatures on the roses and on the wallpaper. He was not afraid. At every moment, nature signified by some laughing hint, like the gold spot which went round the wall. There. Her determination to show by brandishing her plumes, shaking her tresses, flinging her mantle this way and that, beautifully, always beautifully, and standing close up to breathe through her hollowed hands Shakespeare's words, her meeting. Miracles, revelations, agonies, loneliness, falling through the sea down into the flames, all were burnt, for he had a sense as he watched Rezia trimming the straw hat for Mrs. Peters of a coverlet of flowers. "It's too small for Mrs. Peters," said Septimus. "She shall have a beautiful hat," he murmured, taking up this and that, Rezia kneeling by his side, looking over his shoulder. Now it was finished. That is to say, the design. She must stitch it together, but she must be very, very careful, he said. He kept it just as he had made it. It was wonderful. Never had he done anything which made him feel so proud. It was so real. It was so substantial. Mrs. Peters' hat. "Just look at it," he said.
Yes, it would always make her happy to see that hat. He had become himself then. He had laughed then. They had been alone together. Always she would like that hat.
He was very tired. He was very happy. He would sleep. He shut his eyes, but directly he saw nothing. The sounds of the game becoming fainter and stranger. It sounded like the cries of people seeking and not finding, and passing further and further away. They had lost him. She must be brave and drink something, for her husband was horribly mangled, would not recover consciousness. She must not see him, must be spared as much as possible, would have the inquest to go through, poor young woman.
It seemed to her as she drank the sweet stuff that she was opening long windows, stepping out into some garden. But where? The clock was striking. 1, 2, 3. How sensible the sound was compared with all this thumping and whispering, like Septimus himself. She was falling asleep, but the clock went on striking. 4, 5, 6, and Mrs. Fillmore, waving her apron, seemed part of that garden, or a flag. She had once seen a flag slowly rippling out from a mast when she stayed with her aunt in Venice. Men killed in battle were thus saluted, and Septimus had been through the war. Of her memories, most are happy.
One of the triumphs of civilization, Peter Walsh thought. It is one of the triumphs of civilization, as the light high bell of the ambulance sounded. His light overcoat blew open. He stepped with indescribable idiosyncrasy, leant a little forward, tripped, with his hands behind his back and his eyes still a little hawk-like. He tripped through London towards Westminster, observing. Was everybody dining out then? Doors were being opened for ladies wrapped like mummies in shawls with bright flowers on them, ladies with bare heads. And in respectable quarters, with stucco pillars through small front gardens lightly swathed with combs in their hair, having run up to see the children. Women came, men waited for them, with their coats blowing open and the motor started. Everybody was going out. What with these doors being opened and the descent and the start, it seemed as if the whole of London were embarking in little boats moored to the bank, tossing on the waters, as if the whole place were floating off in carnival. But it was her street, this Clarissa's. Cabs were rushing round the corner, like water round the piers of a bridge. Drawn together, it seemed to him, because they bore people going to her party. Clarissa's party. The cold stream of visual impressions failed him now as if the eye were a cup that overflowed and let the rest run down its china walls unrecorded. The brain must wake now. The body must contract now, entering the house, the lighted house, where the door stood open, where the motor cars were standing and bright women descending. The soul must brave itself to endure. He opened the big blade of his pocket knife.
How delightful to see you.
She said it to everyone. How delightful to see you. She was at her worst, effusive, insincere. It was a great mistake to have come. He should have stayed at home and read his book, thought Peter Walsh. Should have gone to a music hall. He should have stayed at home, for he knew no one.
The curtain with its flight of birds of paradise blew out again, and Clarissa saw. She saw Ralph Lyon beat it back and go on talking. So it wasn't a failure after all. It was going to be all right now. Her party. It had begun. It had started. But it was still touch and go. She must stand there for the present. People seemed to come in a rush. She had felt that intoxication of the moment, that dilatation of the nerves of the heart itself, till it seemed to quiver, steeped, upright. Yes, but after all, it was what other people felt, that. For, though she loved it and felt it tingle and sting, still these semblances, these triumphs, dear old Peter, for example, thinking her so brilliant, had a hollowness. At arm's length they were, not in the heart. And it might be that she was growing old, but they satisfied her no longer as they used. It was enemies one wanted, not friends. Not Mrs. Durant and Clara, Sir William and Lady Bradshaw, Miss Trulock and Eleanor Gibson, whom she saw coming upstairs. They must find her if they wanted her. She was for the party. A young man, that is what Sir William is telling Mr. Dalloway, had killed himself. He had been in the army. Oh, thought Clarissa, in the middle of my party, here's death, she thought. She had once thrown a shilling into the Serpentine, never anything more. But he had flung it away. They went on living. She would have to go back. The rooms were still crowded. People kept on coming. All day she had been thinking of Borton, of Peter. They would grow old. A thing there was that mattered, a thing wreathed about with chatter, defaced, obscured in her own life, let drop every day in corruption, lies, chatter. This he had preserved. Death was defiance. Death was an attempt to communicate, people feeling the impossibility of reaching the center which, mystically, evaded them. Closeness drew apart, rapture faded, one was alone. There was an embrace in death. She felt somehow very like him, the young man who had killed himself. She felt glad that he had done it, thrown it away. The clock was striking. The leaden circles dissolved in the air. He made her feel the beauty, made her feel the fun. But she must go back. She must assemble. She must find Peter. And she came in from the little room.
A snob was she? Yes, in many ways. Where was she all this time? It was getting late. He had not found life simple. His relations with Clarissa had not been simple. It had spoilt his life, he said. One could not be in love twice, he said. And what could she say? Still, it is better to have loved. But he would think her sentimental. He used to be so sharp. I will come, said Peter. But he sat on this for a moment. What is this terror? What is this ecstasy, he thought to himself? What is it that fills me with extraordinary excitement? It is Clarissa, he said. For there she was.
This program was produced by Lighthouse Productions, featuring sections of the novel Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, read by Caitlyn Walter, Jacob Sliger, Christina Thibodeau, Edward Jones, and David Huston. Editing for today's episode by Kathryn Powell, sound effects by audioblocks.com, freeFX.com, and incompetech.com. Equipment and recording courtesy of Bracken Library, Doherty Hall. I'm Anna Miller, and thanks for listening to this episode of Novel Perceptions.